What a privilege it is to be able to share with you all, both of you who are in this room and those who are present otherwise, or may check this out a couple of years from now, who knows when. Well, because this is my third semester up here, I had a hint that I might have the opportunity to speak in chapel. And everybody's got their favorite passages of Scripture they like to talk about. Well, mine comes from the book of 1 Samuel, and it's all about a great hero of the faith, Jonathan, who slaughtered all kinds of, and left blood all over the field, and it was all Philistine blood, and he did it in the name of the Lord. And it makes for a great chapel address, if you can talk about that. And that's what I brought up to Canada with the expectation I would talk about. And so, sure enough, a phone call came, and I was invited to speak in chapel. And I said, I'd be pleased to do that. And thinking, got it all set up, ready to go. And then they said, now, we want you to speak on February 14th. And I'm thinking, okay, that's Valentine's Day. I may need to rethink this a little bit. And so I prayed about it, and the Lord said, yeah, I do want you to speak. It's going to be February 14th. You're stuck with that. And what's more, not only is it Valentine's Day, but for the second time in my lifetime, it is not only Valentine's Day, but it's also the kickoff day for Lent, the Lenten season. It's Ash Wednesday. Now, if you were raised like I was in the Southern Baptist tradition, that didn't automatically mean anything to me whatsoever. But as Martha and I have matured in the faith, we have come to realize that one of the gifts that our forebears within Christianity have given us is the gift of a Christian calendar that uses each day of the year in different ways to celebrate some aspect of God's gift to us through Jesus. And as Christians throughout the centuries have thought about it, and it wasn't a hard question to answer. They said, what if we're going to have certain days of the year that we're going to pick out as special days, what days would they be? Well, how about Jesus' birthday? That's a great day. Problem is, nobody knew when Jesus' birthday was, so they just picked a really special day that worked well for everybody, and that was, we call it Christmas. Different Christian traditions actually celebrate a different day for Jesus' birthday, but they all celebrate that. That's a great thing to remember. The fact that God came to earth, that's a wonderful thing. But is there anything else that we should remember? Yeah, if there's one more thing, and in fact perhaps even a more important thing that we could remember, that we could set a day aside to remember, how about the day that Jesus died for our sins? The day that Jesus gave the gift of eternal life through his own shed blood. Well, as Christians thought about it, they said, that is not just a good day. That's not just a great day. That is such a big day that maybe we should celebrate it in an extended way. Maybe we should even use a whole season of the year to prepare our hearts to remember and enjoy the gift that God gave us of his blood shed on the cross. And thus, I'm convinced, was born the Lenten season. How many days do you want to set aside for that? Well, think about biblical numbers. You could make it 3, you could make it 7, but the number 40 is another good biblical number, so 40 days are set aside for that purpose. And it's a beautiful thing. And today is that day that we kick off those 40 days to remember the greatest day in human history. And so my chapel address needs to talk about love, and it's got to talk about more than that, the Lenten season and Easter ultimately. And so here we go. It's been said, you can read it on the internet if you doubt it, and so you know it's true, that according to those who've studied these things and who believe in an old earth, there, in the long history of humanity, approximately 117 billion human beings that have ever lived. 117 billion, that's a lot of people. Today, currently alive on the planet, there are about 8.1 billion, okay? 8.091, but still, billions of people. Now, if you were going to write a love story, and this is the love season, if you're going to write a love story, and you had 117 billion people that you could write about in theory, but you only were allowed to pick one, who would you pick? Well, for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the answer was easy. That one person's going to be Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ, the God-man. He is in a category all by himself. He is as human as me, and that's not saying much, okay? Not anything big to brag about. But more than that, he was a sinless human being, and even more than that, so he lived a better life than I ever could have, ever did, ever will. But more than that, he is actually fully God. And to have that one being, out of 117 billion, there's only one human being that's ever existed that is not only fully human, but also fully God. I guess if I were going to pick one, I'd agree with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's a good guy to pick. That's the right one. All right, so, and Dr. Booth, correct me if I'm wrong, but Jesus lived somewhere between 30 and 40 years on this planet. Can you give us exactly how many years Jesus lived?
33 years, 2 months, and 6 days.
Well, you and Bishop Usher are incredible. You guys know all those things right down to the. So, what day of the week was he born on? I want to know that. Never mind. No, never mind. That's all right. That's all right. Okay, we're going to go with the 33 years. All right. I love spreadsheets. I'm addicted to spreadsheets. So you need to know that. It doesn't change anything, but if Jesus lived 33 years. I won't give you the exact number of days, but I will say that the story of Jesus, if he's truly the God-man, then it would be worth writing something about every day that the God-man lived on planet Earth, because it's the only time it's happened in human history, and he fundamentally changed the direction of human history. Wouldn't it be important to know something about every day that he lived? Yes, it would. Okay, in my mind, it would be. And so, why doesn't any of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, talk about every day of Jesus' life? Well, the answer is because God told those 4 writers that certain days in Jesus' life were more important than others. So you ask yourself, okay, out of the 33, 2 months, 6 days, that Jesus lived, which days are more important? Well, we can figure out which days they thought were more important by reading their stories. And as you read the story of Jesus in any of those Gospels, you'll see that there are actually 8 days in Jesus' life, all connected together as one little slice of life, a connected slice of life. All of those 8 days stand out by word count as the single most important part of the story of this guy who lived for 33 years. What 8 days are most important in your life? Well, I don't know, and that's between you and God, and people might have different opinions. But in Jesus' life, according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 8 days out of those 33 plus years are the ones that God wanted us to know about. Those days stretch from not from Ash Wednesday, but from Palm Sunday to Easter. Okay, that's coming up, and we're moving toward those days. Okay, so those 8 days, of the stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you add them all together, add up all the word counts in the Greek, and of course I did that last night. I really did, and I'm not going to bore you with the numbers, but let me just say that in those 8 days, basically 1/3 of the entire story of Jesus' life describes what the events of those 8 days of Jesus' life. Okay? And so, in fact, if every one of those days was given, if the words that were used to describe those 8 days were given to all the 8-day chunks in Jesus' life would, the Gospels would contain 9.8 million words. Okay? They currently contain, round numbers, 65,000 words, Greek words. We're talking Greek words here. So 9.8 million words. It's all been, this is why God didn't give us that much for not even Dr. Peacock's reading assignments are that big. I mean, this would have been too much. It just would have been overwhelming. And so this is good. 8 days out of the God-man's life are the ones that we focus on. And what took place in those? And how do you tell the story of those 8 days? How do you tell the story of the God-man? I'm a narratologist. I love stories. I love narrative. And I've studied many different aspects of it. In Hebrew, particularly, Hebrew narrative is kind of my thing. As long as you give me a spreadsheet and a Hebrew text, I'm happy, okay? And my wife can confirm that. It's true. And yet we're still going on 45 years of marriage, so she's accepted it. It's just the truth. And so you're going to tell the story of the most important human being out of 117 billion that ever lived. You're going to tell the story that focuses on 8 days out of this guy's life. The story's got to start somewhere, because if you just jump into that Jesus journey to Jerusalem that we celebrate on Palm Sunday, people aren't going to know enough of the background to know where to start. So the question is, where do we begin? Where do we start the story of Jesus? And it is a fascinating study in the 4 Gospels to see exactly where the different writers began their story. And it's a little bit different in every one of them. It's not the same. And so let's start with Mark. Did Mark, was that the one that was written first, Steve? Or maybe, you know. It keeps the scholars off the streets to think about it and write about it. So that's a helpful thing. And so the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in the prophet. Whoa, we're going back to the Old Testament. No wonder I'm up here. Okay, no wonder I can talk about this. Mark actually started the story of Jesus with a promise and a prophecy found in the Old Testament. See, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way. So Mark started the story of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, with he says it's written in Isaiah the prophet, and he'll get to that. But the first thing he said is actually from Malachi chapter 3, verse 1. And that's the last book in what is known as the latter prophets of the Old Testament. So, and since the Ketuvim was probably not an official part of the Jewish canon in this day, he basically started from the last book in the Old Testament as it was commonly used in the first century. And so that's a good place to start. Start with a promise that God made hundreds of years before. That promise is a promise that was reinforced with a prophecy from Isaiah. A voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord for the Lord. Make his paths straight. This is a prophecy from Isaiah chapter 40 that points to, almost a contemporary, perhaps a genuine contemporary of Mark, John the Baptist. So that you have a story, as Mark is starting his love story, his context begins with a couple of hundreds of year old words, one of which was maybe 450 years old, another one 700 years old, that pointed to a guy that would show up in Mark's lifetime or just before it. He was alive, certainly during part of the time Mark was alive. John the Baptist. Where do you start the story of the greatest man that ever lived, of the greatest love story ever written? You start it with something that goes back hundreds of years, something that also showed up in Mark's lifetime. You start it with, in fact, a relative of Jesus. You start it with John the Baptist. And that's Mark. That's the way he chose to do it. Thankfully, I was given a Bible. Thank you, Martha. I think you are partially responsible for this, if not completely. A nice leather Bible with 3 markers because I need all 3 of them for this. So we're going to switch to Matthew, and I'm using my black string this time. So the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 starts with a genealogy. He's actually borrowing a phrase from the Septuagint right there that corresponds to these are the generations, va'ela toldot in the Hebrew. This is the account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The translator of the CSB wrote it as the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham, that Abraham lived before the days of Malachi. He lived before the days of Isaiah. When Matthew starts his love story, he starts it way back in the Old Testament. He goes all the way back to the Torah. He goes back to Genesis 12. He goes back to the story of Abraham, or Genesis 11 is actually where Abraham's first mentioned, Avram. And so Matthew says, you know, Mark, I'm going to steal a bunch of your stuff, but when I write my gospel, but you didn't start right. You need to go back generations before the days of Malachi, before the days of Isaiah. We're going to go all the way back to Abraham. So that in verse 2, we have a genealogy that speaks of Abraham, who fathered Isaac, who fathered Jacob, and we go all the way down, tracing a line, a lineage, that began with a God who made a promise of a new homeland for people, a special homeland, and a story that is so amazing that you need to take Old Testament 1 to learn more about it. So if you haven't taken that yet, take it. And if you can get a book study on the book of Genesis, take it. And if you can get a special study of the life of Abraham, sign up for it. It's a rich story. And Matthew said, you know, we need to start the story of Jesus with Matthew. Matthew said we need to start the story of Jesus with Abraham. And so he did. And so that's wonderful. And it's the story of a man whose life is forever changed by a God who came to him and who made a promise and who led him over treacherous paths and through incredibly dangerous situations to bless him beyond measure. And so, starting with that kind of individual, Matthew said, that's a good place, because that's what God does with each of us as well, because of this man whose love story I'm going to tell. And that's Matthew. And then we move over to the third gospel, Luke. How did Luke tell his love story of Jesus? Well, we start with chapter 1. Again, a good place to start. And as you read through the first 3 chapters of Luke, you say, well, he's kind of all over the place. He started several different places. But the first place he started, interestingly enough, was in Luke 1:5, as he gives a short introduction to probably a guy who paid him to write this. We'll never know for sure, but he might have been to a God seeker, and who was apparently rich and honorable. And Luke wrote this story. And so he tells the story of Jesus, and he begins with this. In the days of King Herod of Judea. Whoa, first named individual is some mass murdering politician. What a place to start the story, the greatest love story ever. This is crazy. And yet that's exactly what Herod was. And yet that's where the story of God's love began as well. God came to a world that is full of crooked politicians that do ugly things that hurt people in the name of building up their own reputation and creating what they hope will be an enduring dynasty that will be remembered forever. Luke said, you need to recognize that God's love pierces and penetrates the ugliness of the human condition. And it just jumps right into the ugly spots and shows its love right there. What a beautiful way to start a story. It's very different from what Mark and Matthew did. But wow, I love it. That's cool and unexpected. In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest in Abijah's division named Zechariah. And as you go forward in this, and we don't have time to do this in detail, take Dr. Booth's class on the Gospels. Have you got a course on the Gospels? It's a good seminary to do that. That's good. you'll find that this is a story about an old, worn-out man who married in his youth, probably. Everybody did. As soon as they could afford to support a family with their income, they tried to get married, typically around age 30 or so, probably. He was now in his old and diminished years. And though he had a very long and loving marriage, he never produced a child. And there comes a point in your life when you say, I can't leave a whole lot behind that isn't going to rot. But there is one thing I would like to leave behind, and that's a child. Somebody who can carry on my dreams and my hopes and my DNA. And if you're a Christian, also someone who can do the work of God in the next generation. God, I'd like to give you a gift, the gift of a child who will love you with all their heart and serve you. And Zechariah was a godly man, and we suspect that he wanted that, but he never got it. And so Luke's second character of significance in his beginning point for the story of the love of God is a man who had dead dreams in his life, who had lived a faithful life and had nothing to leave behind, but who had still a love for God. And that love for God connected with a promise of God that Mark has already told us about and that Matthew is well aware of, a promise that went back for centuries and maybe even for thousands of years, the promise of God doing something new and of eternal value for all of humanity. And God picked the era when there was almost maniacal politician out there who would kill anybody that got in his way and not think twice about it, who was willing to spend the equivalent of billions of dollars on personal projects to try to make people love him, like the temple and other things that he had done, but in that era also a man who had lived for God and he felt like cheated by God, never given a child to give as a gift to future generations. And Luke said that's where God goes when he wants to show his love. He picks ugly spots and he brings beauty. He picks places of death and he gives life. It's a beautiful thing. John started somewhere different. John said, come on, guys. You know that's not where the story of God's love begins. So let's get it right. And John wrote this quite a bit later, as far as we understand, than the other Gospels. And so he'd had a chance to see what they all had to say. And it was all good, and there's nothing wrong with what Matthew, Mark, and Luke had done. But John said, wait, come on. Let's write the final chapter on this. And so here it goes. John chapter 1. Where does the story of God's love begin? John 1:1. En arche in ho logos. In beginning was the Word. In the beginning was the Word. Where does the story of God's love begin? It begins in the beginning. Like Matthew, brilliantly, frankly, the elder writer John said, it doesn't begin with Abraham. It actually continues with Abraham, but it goes all the way back, not to Genesis 12:1, but to Genesis 1:1. He's borrowing the language, this time not of one of the genealogies of the Old Testament, but from the opening phrase of the Bible. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Except now it's in the beginning, God created. No, in the beginning, even before God created, God was. It's as though John is saying, we're going to start with Genesis 1. I'm going to give you the first two words from the Septuagint there. But let's talk even before God created. God was. God was. Where does the story of God's love begin? It not only begins with Malachi and Isaiah and Abraham. It begins, and we could, if we'd had time, looked in Luke's genealogy. Finally got around to it in the third chapter. By the way, he also had a beginning in Jesus' life with Mary. It's good to start with the mother of Jesus. But it also goes all the way back to Adam, who was the Son of God, that unexpected phrase right there, not taken from the Old Testament. Adam, the Son of God. So that Luke was looking forward to a greater Son of God. But John said, yeah, okay, even before Genesis 1:27, when Adam was created, even before God created the earth, the Word was already there. The Word was already there. Where does the story of Easter begin? Where does the story of the final 8 days begin? Where does the story of Jesus begin? It begins not even in time. It begins with God. And God is not limited by time. Where does the story of Easter begin? It begins with the God who pre-existed time. That's a powerful thought for me. And controversially, in Revelation, another writing of John, traditionally understood to be written by the same John of the Gospel. Talk to scholars for different opinions, but I'm okay with that. And in this amazing last book of the Bible, a climactic book in so many ways. My wife's even been leading a Bible study on it. I hadn't gotten a chance to finish it because we came up to Canada, but I guess you get back to it when you get back to the States. In Revelation chapter 13, verse 8, there is a verse that for centuries, since 1384, since the days of John Wycliffe, who produced the first English Bible, English language Bible, John 13:8 speaks of a truth that I think John meant for us to understand. Now, he said it different ways, but in 13:8 he did a unique thing in the Greek grammar, Greek syntax of a sentence here, that in the days of John Wycliffe, in the days of Tyndale, in the 1500s, 1535, in the days of the King James Version, 1611, in the days of the Geneva Bible before that, 1560, was always understood to make a powerful truth that I think conveys something that John wanted to be conveyed that is often lost in 21st century translations, unfortunately. But let's look at Revelation 13:8 to see how John reinforced the message of John chapter 1, verse 1. This concept of a pre-existing, prehistoric, if you please, beginning to the story of Easter. Revelation 13:8 says it this way in the Christian Standard Bible, and I bear no responsibility for the New Testament translations, only 1 Samuel and parts of Exodus. All those who live on the earth will worship it, and we're talking about an ugly time in Israel, in world history, actually, in the future here. All those who live on earth will worship this demonic being, maybe the devil himself. Everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. That's a fine, that accurately translated every individual Greek word, the way the Christian Standard Bible did it. Let me read a key phrase right now. Everyone whose name was not written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slaughtered. If you were to go back to Wycliffe, to Tyndale, to the Geneva Bible, to the KJV, and to almost every version that has been translated up until the middle of the 20th century, that is not the way it would read. It would read reflective of the Greek syntax that is found right here. There is a certain phrase in this text. I won't give you the Greek, but let's just say from the foundation of the world. The question is, where does that phrase from the foundation of the world, what do you glue it to? Do you glue it to the book of life that was written before the foundation of the world, or do you do it like the Greek does? You put it at the very end of the sentence. The Lamb who was slaughtered before the foundation of the world. That's actually the way the Greek reads. If you were to just read it straight through, you put that phrase from the foundation of the world, where it shows up in the Greek text, we have a lamb who was slain before the foundation of the world. Where does the story of Easter begin? John said it began with God. Even before God created, he was. And in the beginning was the Word. He reinforces it and really, I think, puts a bright exclamation point and a triple underlining at this point. God's plan for your salvation began before God ever created you. God wanted you to be a part of his family before he ever brought you into this world. God's love is so big that it stretches beyond time. Time past before creation and time beyond after you're dead. There is never a time when God will not love you. And that's part of the story of Easter. And if you just let the love stories of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John proceed and just read them for what these writers intended them to be, one thing will strike you. If this story's real, that there is a God who existed before time began, before I ever was created, who made me and who watched me live in a world full of crazed politicians and broken dreams and bad things, and still reach down to love me, and who will love me beyond the end of time. That's a love story. That's the one, and I want to love the guy who loves me that much. I want to love, and the call of Christians is to not only enjoy that love, but to share it. Share it richly over the days. Write your own love story and give God the glory, even as the gospel writers did. Thank you very much, and let's close in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for your love. Thank you for a Christian calendar that gives us the opportunity every year, because we repeat the calendar every year, to remember that you came into this world. Thank you for Christmas. But Lord, even more than that, thank you that you gave yourself and you shed divine blood for human sin. It's the only thing that's valuable enough to pay the sin debt that all of us have racked up in our lives. Thank you for giving us, through the gift of the Christian community, 40 days when we can focus on your love and the greatness of your gift. May we never take it for granted. May we live out its implications in the highest and most noble of ways. And Lord, may we share it freely with those around us as we have the opportunity. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.